No one's watching. The house is empty. Just once, Julian's feet stopped at the edge of the dark room. The Steinway stood in the moonlight, still shrouded, still breathing that scent he had carried in his bones for 26 years without knowing its name. He had no reason to cross the floor. Every sensible part of him knew that. He crossed the floor anyway. He sat down. He lifted the cover. Nobody knew what that one forbidden act was about to unlock. His hands found the opening phrase before his mind could stop them, and the nocturne poured out, flawless, haunting, note by note by note. Then the staircase creaked. Julian. Just one word. But someone in this world knew that name. And the fact that someone remembered it meant someone else had erased it. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. Tonight a melody is taking everything back. The rain arrived before dawn, the kind that didn't announce itself. No thunder, no warning wind, just a slow, cold curtain drawn across Westchester County while most of its residents were still asleep. By the time the streetlights began to flicker against the wet pavement, the gutters were already running fast, carrying cigarette wrappers and dead leaves toward somewhere darker and lower. Liam sat in the Cadillac and did not move. The car was parked on Fenton Street, 2 blocks from the employment agency that had placed him, the engine off, the heat already fading from the vents. He had arrived 40 minutes early, not from eagerness, but from the particular anxiety of a man who has never once in his life been able to afford being late. He'd learned that in foster care, where tardiness was a moral failing and punctuality was the closest thing to currency a kid without a last name could offer. His hands rested on the wheel even now, even with the engine off, fingers curled around the leather as though he needed something to hold. Outside, the rain tapped against the windshield in a rhythm he couldn't name but somehow knew, a soft, insistent 34 time, like the ghost of a waltz. He looked at the passenger seat. The 401k contribution statement from Sterling Media Group's employment portal lay there, still creased from where he'd folded it in his jacket pocket 3 days ago and unfolded it again every night since. The numbers were not cruel in themselves. It was a decent driver's salary, health coverage, paid parking. But Liam had done the math on the back of a Con Edison envelope, and the math didn't lie. Margaret's costs were rising. The memory care facility in Astoria had sent a letter last month, a gentle letter, professionally worded, which somehow made it worse, explaining that the monthly rate would increase by 11% beginning in January. Margaret Holt, who had taken in a 6-year-old boy nobody wanted and called him her son for 26 years, was running out of time that Liam didn't have the money to buy. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, as if the pressure might quiet something inside. Just a job, he told himself. Get in, drive, stay quiet, get paid. He had repeated it to himself on the subway this morning, standing in the fluorescent blur of the 7 train, listening to a woman 3 seats away hum something he almost recognized. He had repeated it walking the 6 blocks from the White Plains station in the rain, the collar of his good jacket darkening with water. He said it now, one more time, in the silence of the cooling car. Just a job. He pulled the door handle and stepped out into the rain. The Sterling estate sat at the far end of a private drive lined with white oaks that had been there longer than the county road they bordered. The iron gates at the entrance were tall and black and ornate in the way that old money makes things ornate, not to be beautiful, but to make it clear that beauty is something you own and others observe. As Liam pulled the Cadillac through on instruction from the intercom, the gates swung open slowly, their hinges groaning with the effort. A sound so low and reluctant it settled in his chest like a held breath. He told himself it was the rain. The driveway curved past a formal garden that had been put to sleep for winter, boxwoods wrapped in burlap, rose canes cut back to stubs, everything tidy and dormant and waiting for something. A stone fountain stood at the center, the basin dry, a layer of wet leaves plastered to the bottom. The main house rose at the end of the drive, 3 stories of pale limestone with tall dark windows, and even with every light on inside, It gave the impression of a house that had not been warm in a long time. A uniformed housekeeper met him at the side entrance and walked him through the kitchen, speaking quickly about schedules and routes and Mr. Sterling's preferences without once making eye contact. Liam nodded at the appropriate intervals and said, "Yes, ma'am," twice and catalogued the details. With the quiet efficiency of someone who has spent a lifetime learning to read rooms before rooms read him. It was in the main foyer that he stopped. He hadn't meant to. The housekeeper was still talking something about the afternoon route to Midtown, but Liam's feet simply ceased forward progress. And he stood on the marble floor and looked at the piano. It was a Steinway concert grand, the kind that belonged on a stage at Carnegie Hall, not in a private residence. It sat against the far wall beneath a heavy black shroud of thick velvet. The fabric pooling slightly at the base, and even covered it, occupied the room the way a sleeping animal occupies a room with a presence, a mass, an implied capacity for something beyond its current stillness. The shroud smelled of sandalwood and something older, something Liam could not name. But that reached directly into a room in his memory he hadn't known had a door. His nostrils flared slightly. The black Escalade is reserved for airport runs, and Mr. Sterling prefers the Cadillac for all local. Yes, Liam said. Understood. He followed her. Arthur Sterling entered the foyer at 8:42, already in his coat, already holding his phone, already somewhere else in his head. He was 65 and wore it the way powerful men who have never been questioned wear their age, as an authority rather than a vulnerability. Silver hair, cut close. A jaw that had probably been handsome once and had since settled into something harder and more deliberate. He moved through the house the way the house itself seemed designed to be moved through, efficiently, without softening. He passed the shrouded piano without a glance. He passed Liam with approximately the same amount of acknowledgement. "Car," he said, to no one in particular, and walked toward the side entrance. Liam moved to open the rear door and did. Arthur slid in without a word. Liam closed it, walked around to the driver's side, settled behind the wheel. In the rearview mirror, Arthur was already reading something on his phone, his face closed and still. It was at that precise moment, waiting for Arthur to give him a destination, that Liam became aware of his own left hand. He was tapping on the door handle, not nervously, not absent-mindedly. His fingers were moving with purpose, with pattern: index, middle, ring, a slight pause, then middle again, in a rhythm he could feel but not account for. He pressed his hand flat against his thigh and stared straight ahead. "Midtown," Arthur said, "46th and Lexington. And I don't like conversation." "Yes, sir." The gates groaned open again as they passed through. Liam did not look in the rearview mirror. He watched the white oaks recede in the side mirror instead, their bare branches catching the rain, and somewhere behind him in the house he'd just left, a young woman in paint-spattered linen was standing at the front window with a cup of tea, going cold in her hand, watching the black Cadillac disappear down the drive. Her name was Chloe, and she had seen Liam's fingers on the door handle. And she recognized the rhythm. The drive to Midtown took 47 minutes in the rain. Liam used all of it. He had learned to use silences productively, another foster care survival skill. Like knowing which adults meant what they said and which ones were rehearsing kindness for an audience. In the silence of the Cadillac, while Arthur Sterling scrolled and tapped and occasionally exhaled with the particular impatience of a man who believes the world runs slow on purpose, Liam catalogued everything he had absorbed in his first hour at the estate. The foyer marble floors, pale gray, sealed to a high shine. The scent near the piano, sandalwood, and something beneath it, something he could only describe as old silk, warm and quiet and insistently familiar. The housekeeper's face when she mentioned Mr. Sterling's schedule, not blank but carefully arranged, the expression of a woman who has practiced saying nothing with great precision for many years. The garden statuary, a stone girl pouring water from a jar that had been dry since at least October. The locked door off the second hallway, behind which he had heard nothing, but which had a wheelchair ramp installed beside the threshold. Someone in this house moved slowly. Someone in this house was not entirely well. He filed these things in the quiet filing cabinet he kept at the back of his mind and drove. When he pulled to the curb on 46th Street, Arthur was out of the car before Liam had fully stopped, moving toward the glass tower. With the focused momentum of a man who did not require doors to open themselves because someone would always open them, Liam watched him go through the rain, then sat back in the driver's seat and exhaled once, slowly, the way a diver surfaces. His phone buzzed. Margaret's facility number. He let it go to voicemail. He couldn't talk here, not in this car, not with whatever the morning had already cost him emotionally. He would listen to it tonight in his apartment in Queens, seated on the folding chair beside the window with the cracked sash. The one that let in a thread of cold air no matter the season, eating the bowl of rice and eggs that constituted his Tuesday dinner and pretending to himself that he was fine. He was fine. He pressed his thumb and index finger to the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes for exactly 4 seconds. Then he opened them, checked the mirror, and waited. In the rain-blurred reflection of the building's glass facade, he watched a man who looked almost like himself move through a revolving door on the 32nd floor. He blinked. It was just a reflection. Just the distortion of rain on glass. The way a wet city reshapes everything into something slightly other than what it is. Just a job, he thought. But his left hand had found the door handle again, and his fingers were already moving index, middle, ring, pause. Middle in that rhythm he did not know and could not stop, playing a melody on black leather that he had apparently known since before he knew anything else at all. The rain had not let up by afternoon. Liam sat in the Cadillac in the Sterling Estate's rear courtyard, waiting for Arthur's 2 o'clock return from a lunch that had run long, and he was supposed to be doing nothing. That was, technically, the job in these gaps: sit, wait, be available. He had spent 12 years of his adult life learning to occupy space without disturbing it, and ordinarily he was good at it. Today he could not seem to manage it. He had already wiped down the interior twice. He had reorganized the first aid kit in the glove compartment. He had read the same paragraph of a library paperback 4 times without retaining a word of it. His mind kept returning to the foyer, to the piano under its black shroud, to the smell of sandalwood that had followed him down the hallway and into the kitchen and apparently into the car, because he could still catch it now. Faint, ghost-like, threading through the leather and rain smell of the Cadillac's interior. He told himself he was tired. He told himself it was the pressure of the 401k statement, still folded in his jacket pocket, still tallying numbers that didn't add up to enough. He told himself a lot of things. Then he noticed the cufflink. It was lodged in the seam between the rear passenger seat and the center armrest, half hidden under the edge of the floor mat, a small gold oval with a raised initial. The letter S in a serif font, the kind of monogram that was engraved rather than stamped. Liam reached back and picked it up without thinking much about it, the way you pick up something small and out of place, meaning to set it somewhere sensible. The metal was cold. He turned it over in his palm. Cold gold, the oval weight of it, the slightly raised edge of the engraving pressing into the pad of his thumb. And then the cold moved upward through his wrist and into somewhere behind his eyes, and he saw not the courtyard, not the gray afternoon, not the rain, but a pair of hands. Large hands, a man's hands, the knuckles prominent, the fingers powerful, and those hands were coming down on a piano. Lid not closing it gently but slamming it, the sound of it. A gunshot and a grief simultaneously, and beneath the lid, just before it fell, a glimpse of ivory keys and the trailing end of a melody he almost. The rear door of the Cadillac opened. Liam startled so hard the cufflink rolled off his palm and onto the console. He reached for it automatically and his hand closed around it just as Arthur Sterling folded himself into the back seat. Shaking rain from his coat collar, phone already in his hand, already dialing. He looked at Liam's hand. Liam's hand was holding the cufflink. The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long. In another context, in another relationship between 2 men of more equal standing, it might have been nothing. But in the Sterling Estate's rear courtyard, in a black Cadillac that smelled of leather and sandalwood. And something Liam couldn't name. Those 3 seconds had the density of something much longer. "Don't touch," Arthur said. "What doesn't belong to you?" His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of authority that doesn't require volume, flat, final. Carrying the implicit understanding that the cost of repetition would be significantly higher than the cost of compliance. Liam set the cufflink on the console between them and said, "I apologize, sir. I found it in the seat." Arthur took it without acknowledging the explanation. He was already looking at his phone again. "Midtown," he said. "Different address. I'll send it to your GPS." "Yes, sir." Liam pulled out of the courtyard. His heart was hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. And everything to do with something he couldn't identify, a recognition without a referent. A familiarity without a memory attached to it. Like hearing a song in a language you've never spoken but somehow, in some deep cellular way, understand. He kept his face neutral and his hands steady on the wheel and his eyes on the wet road ahead, and he said nothing more. But in the seat beside him, on the passenger side, the flash of those large hands slamming down on piano keys replayed itself without invitation, and Liam pressed his jaw tight and drove north through the rain. It was on the return journey, just before 4 o'clock, that he saw Eleanor Sterling for the first time. He had been told about her only in passing the housekeeper's brief, careful mention of Mrs. Sterling's schedule. In the same tone one mentions a fixed calendar item rather than a person. Arthur had not spoken of her. The employment agency's briefing materials had listed her as the household's secondary principal, with a note that said all scheduling requests to be routed through Mr. Sterling's office, which was the kind of administrative language that could mean many things and in this case, felt like it meant one specific thing that nobody was saying aloud. She was in the garden. The rain had dropped to a thin mist by mid-afternoon, the kind of precipitation that couldn't decide what it was doing. And Eleanor Sterling stood on the stone path between the sleeping rosebeds in a cream wool coat that was too light for the temperature and a pair of house slippers that had no business being outdoors. She was 62, and she was beautiful in the way a photograph of something is beautiful, fixed, remote, the light in the image. Slightly different from the light in the room where you're holding it. She was looking at a small plastic pill organizer. Not taking a pill, not putting a pill away. Looking at it, with the focused, effortful attention of someone trying to solve a problem that keeps rearranging its own terms. 3 of the 7 compartments were empty. She was pressing her thumb against one of the empty compartments, opening it, closing it, opening it again, her lips moving slightly. Liam had pulled the Cadillac to the side entrance and cut the engine before he realized he was watching her. He sat for a moment longer than he should have. Something about the image, the cream coat, the slippers, the mist collecting on her silver-streaked hair. The 3 empty compartments pulled at something in him with the same inexplicable insistence as the piano and the cufflink and the smell of sandalwood. As though this woman and those objects were points on a map whose shape he couldn't yet read. Her eyes moved toward the car. They were gray-green and, for a moment, startlingly sharp, not the vacant gaze of someone medicated into softness, but a sudden, clear, searching look, the look of a person who has been trying to remember something for a very long time and is constantly, perpetually, almost there. Liam looked away first. He got out of the car and opened Arthur's door and followed the correct protocol, and when he glanced toward the garden again, Eleanor was already moving back toward the house, the pill organizer pressed against her palm, the slippers darkened with wet grass. That evening, in his apartment in Queens, Liam listened to Margaret's voicemail. "Liam, honey, it's just me. Don't worry, I'm fine, I'm fine. The girls here are very nice. I just wanted to hear your voice. You sound tired on your messages lately. Are you eating? Call me when you can. I love you, sweet boy." He played it twice. Then he sat on the folding chair by the cracked window and ate his rice and eggs. and looked at the 401k statement and looked at the Medicare rejection notice and looked at the photo he kept on the windowsill himself at 6 years old. Standing in front of what appeared to be a birthday cake, one candle lit. His face turned slightly away from the camera as though he'd heard something. He had no memory of who had taken the picture. He had no memory of who had been standing behind him. He had no memory of the room, or the house, or the city where it had been taken. He only knew that the birthday cake had been chocolate, and that there had been music playing, and that the music had smelled inexplicably. The way only memory can make a thing smell of sandalwood and soft silk. He put the photo face down on the windowsill and went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. The gala had been Eleanor's idea, once. That was the rumor among the domestic staff, passed in the kitchen in the careful, fragmentary way that household employees share information, never a full sentence. Always an implication. Always with at least one exit built into the structure in case the wrong person was listening. Apparently, in the years before whatever had happened to Mrs. Sterling's health, she had organized the annual Sterling Foundation charity gala herself, the flowers, the guest list, the caterers, the program. It had been a genuine event. People had come because they wanted to, not only because Arthur Sterling's invitations carried the quiet weight of professional consequence. Now Arthur organized it, which meant his assistant organized it, which meant it was efficient and well-funded and entirely without warmth. Liam arrived at 5 o'clock to transport the last wave of catering supplies from the van to the east entrance, because the kitchen had been short-staffed since noon and the housekeeper had asked with the particular tone of a woman who was not actually asking. He had changed into the black server's uniform they provided, and he stood in the kitchen for 20 minutes. Being told where things went by a caterer from a Bronx company who was stressed and specific and absolutely correct about everything. And then he was handed a silver tray of champagne flutes and sent into the main hall. The house at night was a different country. Every chandelier blazed. The marble floors reflected the light back up from below, so that walking across the foyer felt like walking on water that had solidified just for the occasion. The shrouded piano, Liam noticed immediately, had been moved to the far corner, still covered, but repositioned as though someone had decided it should be less visible, which had the paradoxical effect of making it the first thing his eyes found every time he crossed the room. The guests arrived in the particular progression of a wealthy guest list, the lower-tier names first, establishing the social atmosphere, followed by the mid-tier names who were genuinely important, followed at the end by Arthur Sterling's inner circle, who arrived late as a matter of principle. By 7 o'clock the main hall held approximately 60 people, and the noise level had reached that specific register of a party where everyone is performing a version of themselves. That is slightly too confident, slightly too amused, slightly too unimpressed by everything. Liam moved through it with his tray and his trained invisibility and said nothing. Arthur Sterling was in the center of a cluster of investors near the fireplace, a group of men in their 60s, whose collective net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations, and he was performing the particular kind of relaxed authority that powerful men perform in rooms they own. His voice was carrying intentionally, Liam suspected, and he was in the middle of what sounded like an anecdote about a property acquisition, when he looked up and saw Liam crossing toward the bar with an empty tray. He did not look away immediately. He let his gaze rest on Liam for a moment longer than courtesy or indifference required. Not hostile, exactly. Something more specific than hostility, the focused, calculating attention of a man taking inventory. Then he returned to his investors and continued the anecdote, and Liam continued toward the bar, and that was that. Except it wasn't. The pianist arrived at 7:30. He was young, mid-20s, probably, with the carefully disheveled appearance of someone performing the role of artist for an audience that needed to recognize the costume. Arthur introduced him to the room with the kind of elaborate warmth he never directed at actual warmth, calling him a rising star, a genuine talent, the kind of young creative energy that Sterling Foundation was proud to support. The guests applauded with their champagne glasses in hand. The pianist smiled and sat down and played something angular and modern and technically impressive that filled the room without settling anywhere, like weather. It was during the second piece that Chloe Sterling appeared at Liam's elbow. He had not seen her since that first morning, when she had watched him from the window. Up close she was sharper than he'd expected, paint stained at the cuticles despite her gown. Her dark hair pinned with something that might have been a brush handle, her gaze direct in the way of someone who has decided that social performance is optional. She was carrying a glass of red wine and wearing the expression of a person enduring something. "You're the new driver," she said. "Yes, miss. You tap things." He looked at her. "In the car, the first morning," she said, not unkindly. "The door handle, index, middle, ring, pause, middle. Do you know what you were playing?" "No." She studied him for a moment. "Interesting," she said, in a tone that meant she thought it was considerably more than interesting. And then she turned back toward the room, and Liam's attention was pulled away by a crash from the direction of the pianist. Not the pianist himself, Chloe's wine. In turning back toward the room she had shifted her glass too quickly, and a full half of it arched outward and landed on the black velvet shroud of the piano in a dark, spreading bloom. The staff moved immediately. The nearest server reached for the shroud to blot it, pulled at the fabric to assess the damage, and in the process, the entire cover slid from the piano in a single slow cascade and fell to the floor. The Steinway stood exposed. The room registered it with a small collective shift, not dramatic, just a subtle reorientation of attention. The way a room recalibrates when something large and quiet suddenly becomes visible. The pianist paused mid-phrase, looked at the uncovered instrument with a flicker of professional interest, and then returned to his own keyboard. But Liam had stopped moving. He was standing 6 feet from the piano, his empty tray at his side, and looking at the ivory keys with an expression. He was completely unaware he was wearing not wonder, not surprise, but a kind of terrible recognition. The look of a man seeing something he has been missing for so long that the sight of it is indistinguishable from pain. His fingers had started again on his thigh index, middle, ring, pause, middle, and his vision had done something strange at the edges. Not blurring exactly but softening, the way peripheral vision softens when the center of focus becomes very, very sharp. He forced himself to look away, and in looking away, his gaze landed on the side table to Arthur's left, where Arthur had moved his hand quickly, the practiced movement of someone covering something. Rather than simply reaching, and Liam caught a glimpse before the folder closed, a legal document, formal paper stock, official header. 2 names on the signature line. Eleanor Sterling's name, and beside it, a third party's name that Liam did not recognize but whose title he caught in the half-second before Arthur's hand obscured it. Guardian ad litem. He didn't know all the legal terminology. He knew enough. He had spent years adjacent to legal systems that treated people as wards, as managed parties, as persons whose choices required oversight from someone better positioned to make them. He looked at Eleanor, standing near the terrace doors in her cream gown, her champagne untouched, her eyes somewhere above the room. And something cold and certain settled in his chest like a key finding a lock. Then Arthur's voice found him. It was not directed at Liam specifically, it was directed at his investors. The half-circle of well-fed men with their good watches and their patient attention. But it was aimed, the way certain words are aimed. Arthur was telling a story about a recent hire, and the punchline of the story involved a man who had grown up in the state system, who had come to a position of responsibility in someone's household, without the benefit of background, education, or the kind of family foundation that teaches a person what it means to own something rather than just occupy it. He did not look at Liam while he said it. He didn't need to. The men laughed, not cruelly, but with the easy, unself-conscious amusement of people who have never been the subject of a room's laughter, and so cannot measure the weight of it from the inside. One of them said something about blank slates. Another said something about people who couldn't read a basic bank statement if their life depended on it. Arthur smiled with one side of his face. Liam stood with his empty tray and said nothing. He said nothing because he had 17 years of practice in saying nothing when what he had to say would cost him more than silence. He said nothing because Margaret's care cost $4,300 a month. And his balance was $1,142, and silence was currently the most expensive thing he could afford. But his free hand had found the base of the tray, and his fingers were pressing into the metal with enough force to leave marks, and in the center of his chest. Something had ignited that he did not recognize as grief and did not recognize as rage. And only later, much later, would identify correctly as recognition, the specific, devastating recognition of a man who is beginning to understand that the story he has been living is not the one that was written for him. It happened on a Tuesday, the way disasters tend to unremarkably, in the middle of an ordinary task. With no atmospheric warning beyond the ordinary gray of a November morning. Liam was detailing the escalade. It was early before Arthur's scheduled departure, before the household had fully shifted into its daytime arrangement. And Liam was in the rear bay of the estate's 3-car garage, working methodically through the interior of the larger vehicle with a microfiber cloth. And the particular focused quiet that physical work provides. He had been at the Sterling estate for 11 days. He had learned the routes. He had learned the silences. He had learned which staff members would meet your eyes in the kitchen. And which ones had concluded that the safest posture in this household was a kind of practiced disappearance. He had also, in 11 days, not been back inside the main house beyond the foyer and the kitchen, had not been close to the piano again. Had not seen Eleanor except at a distance, and had managed mostly imperfectly to file the strangeness of his first days under the heading of exhaustion and financial anxiety, which was the most rational folder available. This morning's task was uncomplicated. Wipe down, vacuum, check the first aid kit, note the mileage. He was in the backseat, working on the rear door panel, when the conversation from the driveway became audible. Arthur's voice, and another man's lower, measured, the careful cadence of professional legal language. They were walking toward the main house, unhurried, speaking with the frankness of men who believe themselves unobserved. Liam stilled. He was not eavesdropping. He was simply present in a space that the conversation was passing through. And he had learned long ago that the distinction between those two things is mostly a function of social position. The Hamptons property generates enough in rental income to offset. That's the HELOC structure I wanted to revisit, Arthur said. If we refinance before Q1, the liability shifts to the trust rather than. They passed the garage opening. The conversation faded. Liam resumed his work. He found the HELOC notice 4 minutes later. It had slipped behind the rear seat pocket, folded once. Slightly water damaged at one corner, a formal notice from a financial institution, stamped with a property address in the Hamptons. The loan amount was listed at the top. Liam looked at it with the particular attention of someone who has spent years reading financial documents, not because they are relevant to his life, but because understanding how money moves around other people is a survival skill when you have none of your own. He was still reading when the garage door behind him opened and Arthur Sterling walked in. The silence was not like the silence after the cufflink. That one had been calibrated and cold and carried a clear warning. This one was different in quality, shorter, denser, with something inside it that Liam couldn't immediately categorize. Arthur stood in the garage doorway for 2 seconds, his coat on, his briefcase in hand, his eyes on the HELOC notice in Liam's hand. Liam set it on the seat immediately. I found it behind the seat pocket, sir. I was going to leave it on the console. Arthur crossed the garage in 6 steps. He took the notice from the seat without touching Liam, which was the more controlled version of wanting to. He folded it and placed it inside his coat pocket, and then he stood very still for a moment, looking at Liam with the expression of a man running calculations. You were reading it, Arthur said. I noticed the property address, Liam said. I wasn't. I know what you were doing. Arthur's voice was still level. Still that particular flat authority. Men who grow up without property develop a very specific relationship to other people's financial documents. Fascination, resentment, Sometimes both. Liam held his eyes and said nothing. The Hamptons house, Arthur continued, is a private estate matter. Not relevant to your position. Not something you were invited to have an opinion about. I don't have an opinion about it, sir. Then why, Arthur said, do you look like you do? The question sat between them in the garage with the smell of motor oil and cold concrete. And something underneath that again. Inexplicably, impossibly that faint thread of sandalwood, which made no sense here. Which should not have been here. Which Liam's nervous system registered with the same full-body alertness as the piano and the cufflink and Eleanor's gray-green eyes in the garden mist. His blood felt wrong in his veins. He thought of Margaret's voicemail. You sound tired lately. He thought of the balance in his account. He thought of the guardianship document on the table at the gala. He thought of Eleanor in her cream coat pressing her thumb against an empty pill compartment. He thought of a man's hands coming down on a piano lid. I apologize, he said. It won't happen again. Arthur studied him for another 4 seconds, long enough to be uncomfortable, short enough to be technically deniable as anything more than ordinary scrutiny. And then he said, You're finished here. Liam looked at him. Your employment is terminated, effective now. I'll have payroll process your final check through the agency. He paused. Collect your belongings from the locker and leave by the side entrance. Then Arthur Sterling walked out of the garage and across the wet driveway and into his house, and the door closed behind him with the decisive, conclusive sound of a door that knows exactly what it means. Liam sat in his own car, a 12-year-old Civic with a heat issue and a back left tire. He'd been meaning to replace for 6 weeks in the parking structure on the Queen's side of the bridge, and he sat there for 40 minutes without starting the engine. His phone had Margaret's facility number in the recent calls. He had not returned it. His apartment was 4 blocks east, 3rd floor walk-up, 1 bedroom, cracked sash window, folding chair, bowl of rice he wouldn't eat tonight because he had no appetite and nothing to celebrate, and the math of his life had just gotten significantly worse. He looked at his phone. He looked at the cracked screen he'd thrown it against the wall last week, the night after the gala. The night Arthur's voice had found him across a crowded room with its casual inventory of his worth, and the fracture ran from the upper left corner diagonally to the center, giving the screen the appearance of a thing that had been struck with some force and had held together anyway, which felt, this afternoon, like something of an insult rather than a reassurance. He thought about the balance in his account. He had done that math so many times it had lost the quality of calculation and taken on the quality of a familiar wound. Something you know the exact shape and depth of by feel, in the dark, without needing to look. $1,142. Margaret's care $4,300 a month. Next payment due 18 days. He pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth and stared at the parking structure's concrete ceiling, where a water stain had spread in a rough irregular shape that, if you tilted your head, looked almost like a coast. He tilted his head. It still looked like a coast. He had no idea which coast. He had no idea from which direction you were supposed to be viewing it. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the photograph. 6 years old. Birthday cake, 1 candle. Face turned away, toward something, toward someone just out of frame. The blur of movement at the edge of the image that might have been a hand, reaching. The suggestion of a room he couldn't quite reconstruct. The certainty felt rather than remembered, cellular rather than conscious, that there had been music. There had always been music. A melody in 34 time, slow and aching. The kind of melody that doesn't announce itself but stays. He had carried this photograph for 26 years. He had asked Margaret about it when he was 12. When he was 16, when he was 19. She had told him what the agency had told her. Foundling, no parental identification, surrendered at age 6 following a domestic incident, no records beyond the date of intake. She had said it gently each time, with the particular tenderness of a woman who understands that the truth, even when it is incomplete, is still better than a comfortable lie. He had believed her. He still believed her. But 11 days in a house full of covered pianos and empty pill compartments and the smell of sandalwood that had no business being anywhere. He'd been a man who looked at him with the specific fury of someone threatened by a resemblance. He was trying not to see 11 days of that had done something to the file in the back of his mind where he kept the question of who he was, and that something felt like a hinge. "Who am I?" he said, to the fractured phone screen, to the parking structure ceiling, to the coast-shaped water stain and the cold air coming through the Civic's inadequate seals. His voice broke on it not from crying, but from something more specific than crying, the sound a structure makes when the load it's been bearing becomes finally, precisely too heavy for its design. He put the photograph away. He started the engine. He drove home through the rain. Friends, thank you for staying with us through the first half of Julian's story. A man without a past, that's what Liam believed he was. 32 years old, doing his best to hold together a life built on the thinnest of foundations of foster mother. He loved a job he just lost, and a photograph with no answers on the back. But something in that house recognized him, didn't it? The piano that no one was allowed to touch. The woman in the garden with her empty pill compartments. A gold cufflink in his hand. And a memory that didn't belong to his own history, or did it? He's been dismissed, fired, sent out the side entrance, the way Arthur Sterling sends away everything inconvenient. But here's what Arthur doesn't know: Liam went home. And Liam is beginning to remember. The second half of this story is where truth stops being a feeling and starts being evidence. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next changes everything, for everyone in that house on the hill. Stay right here with us. 24 years ago, the world was smaller and quieter and smelled like sandalwood. He was 6 years old, and he did not yet know the word for what his mother wore. He only knew that when she sat beside him on the velvet bench, the scent arrived with her, warm and particular and completely safe, and the combination of that smell and the warmth of her arm beside his and the weight of her hand guiding his small fingers across the keys was the closest thing to hold that he had ever felt before or since. She was teaching him the nocturne, not pushing, guiding, in the way of someone who understands that music is not taught, but recognized, and that a child who already carries it inside simply needs someone to show him where the keys are. His mother had that understanding. She moved his hand through the opening phrase, the melody rising in its gentle, aching 34, the left hand setting the foundation beneath, and when he played it back without her guidance, she made a sound he remembered not as a word but as a warmth, a held breath released, a sound that meant yes, exactly, that, you. His name was Julian. He had forgotten that. The way you forget the name of the street you grew up on when you've been somewhere else long enough. The forgetting is not indifferent, it is protective. The mind knows which doors to keep closed when opening them would cost more than staying in the hallway. His father stood in the doorway. Julian, at 6, did not yet have the vocabulary for the expression on his father's face, the way certain men regard something they love and something they resent simultaneously, the confusion of those two things in a single gaze. He only knew that his father's hands, when he crossed the room, were not open. They were closed. They found the piano lid and came down on its slam in a motion that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the exact territory between them, and the music stopped, and the warmth beside him moved away, and the sandalwood faded, and then there was a boardwalk and a crowd. A balloon that popped like a gunshot, and a hand pulling him away into the gray, and after that, the document on the table, with the trust language, with his name on it. And then nothing. The gray replaced everything. In his apartment, on the night after Arthur fired him, Liam sat on the folding chair by the cracked window and let the memory surface. He did not reach for it. He had learned not to reach. Reaching made it dissolve. He simply sat in the cold draft and let the images arrive in their own order, which was not the order of a story but the order of sensation. The velvet bench first, then the sandalwood, then the keys, then his mother's hand, then his father's closed fists, then the slamming lid, then the boardwalk, then the gray. Then silence, which had lasted 26 years. He was not crying. He was very still and very cold and very certain, in the way that certainty arrives when it has been building for a long time. Underground and finally breaks the surface, not dramatic, not loud, just there, undeniable. He knew whose house he had been working in. He knew whose piano had been covered. He knew whose smell had followed him down every hallway and into every car and into every dream he could not quite catch. He opened his laptop and searched the price of a DNA test kit. $47, expedited shipping. He looked at his account balance. He looked at the number for a long time. Then he went to checkout. The medication was in locker 14. Liam had remembered it 2 days after being fired. Margaret's heart medication. The prescription he had picked up from the pharmacy on his lunch break on his 3rd day at the estate and tucked into his locker in the staff corridor. Because he hadn't wanted to leave it in the car in the cold. Metoprolol succinate. 1 month's supply. $60 he had already spent and could not replace without replacing the whole prescription, which required a doctor's visit he also couldn't afford, and the facility in Astoria did not provide medication from outside suppliers without a formal request that took 10 business days to process. He needed it back. He drove to Westchester on a Wednesday night, which was the night the housekeeper visited her sister in Port Chester and the secondary staff reduced to a skeleton crew. He had noted these rhythms in his 11 days not with any conscious intention, simply because noting rhythms is what people without security do instinctively. The way animals track water sources without deciding to. He parked on the service road, where the estate's wall met the neighboring property's hedge, and he walked in through the side gate, whose code he still had because Arthur's office had not yet notified the security contractor of his termination, which was the kind of administrative gap that opens in large households where efficiency belongs to the principal and the details belong to everyone else. The staff corridor was empty and dark and smelled of floor wax and the distant kitchen. He found locker 14, retrieved the medication, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the corridor, the small orange prescription bottle in his hand, listening to the house breathe. It was not a small sound, the breathing of a house this old. The wind came off the Westchester hills and found every gap in the limestone, and the house responded with a low, continuous murmur, not threatening, but present, the way very old things are present. Liam stood in the corridor and listened to it and felt, with the particular acuity of a man who has just received a memory he'd lost for 26 years, that the house was not indifferent to him. He should have left. He went, instead, toward the sound. The living room was lit only by the moon. It came through the tall western windows in long pale parallelograms, crossing the marble floor in a geometry that shifted almost imperceptibly with the clouds, and in that shifting light, the Steinway stood uncovered. Someone had not replaced the shroud after the gala, or had decided not to, or had made some other choice Liam was not privy to, and it glowed bone white in the center of the room like an altar, like a question, like a thing that has been waiting. Liam sat down. He did not think about it. Thinking would have stopped him, and some part of him, the part that had been tapping rhythms on door handles and car consoles and thighs for 32 years without knowing why, understood that this was not a moment for thinking. He sat on the bench, and he set his hands on the keys, and the keys were cold under his fingers. And the cold was exactly what he remembered, and his hands moved. The nocturne opened itself. It came out of him not like a performance but like a confession, unhurried, achingly precise. Each phrase finding its shape the way water finds a course that was already there, as though the melody had simply been waiting in his hands for the conditions to return. The left hand moved in its long rolling pattern beneath the right hand's singing line, and the sound filled the room, and the room held it, and outside the cold Westchester night received the overflow through the gaps in the limestone, and the white oaks caught it in their bare branches, and Julian. It came from the stairs. He didn't stop playing, not immediately. The word moved through him like the melody, as recognition, as memory made audible. And his hands finished the phrase before they stilled, and in the silence that followed, he turned. Eleanor Sterling was at the top of the staircase, one hand gripping the banister, her silk robe gathered against the cold, and her face Her face was not the vacant, searching face of the garden. It was not the medicated stillness he had seen at the gala. The woman who stood above the room with untouched champagne and eyes focused somewhere beyond the ceiling. It was something else entirely raw, specific, a face cracked open by what the music had done. The gray-green eyes sharp and wet and full of an absolutely certain recognition. Chloe was behind her, one step lower, her hand at Eleanor's elbow, her own face carrying an expression that was less surprise than confirmation, the expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time and has just seen it proven. Liam stood from the bench. His hand moved to his jacket pocket, where the DNA test kit sat in its small white box. $47. Expedited shipping, arrived this morning. Purchased on the last margin of an account that couldn't afford it and had bought it anyway. He drew it out, held it in the moonlight. The room held its breath. Eleanor's hand, on the banister, was trembling not from weakness but from the force of something long contained suddenly pressing at every seam. "Julian," she said again, and this time it was not a question. He should have left. He should have pocketed the DNA kit and held up a hand, the careful, self-protective gesture of a man who has learned to be the one who backs down before situations can become situations. And said something measured about the hour and the intrusion and the medication he'd come to retrieve, and gone back through the staff corridor and out the side gate and driven home to Queens and never come back. He knew how to do this. He had done this his whole life. But Eleanor was walking down the stairs. She came slowly, her hand trailing the banister, Chloe one step behind her with that careful watchfulness, and as she descended, she did not take her eyes off him, not from intensity or accusation, but with the single-minded attention of a woman who has been trying to see something through a fog for a very long time and has finally found a clear line of sight. She reached the bottom of the staircase and stopped. They were 8 feet apart. The moonlight crossed the floor between them. She was smaller than she looked from a distance. The silk robe was pale blue, the same shade as the sky in certain paintings, and her silver-streaked hair fell loose around her shoulders. And she held herself with the particular posture of someone managing pain, not physical pain, but the kind that lives in the architecture of the body, in the set of the jaw and the angle of the shoulders and the long habit of containing things. Her eyes moved over his face with the slow, precise attention of someone reading. "Your birthday," she said. "March 15th. He said nothing. "You favor the left hand," she said. "When you play, you let the melody breathe on the right, but the left hand is where you live." He looked at her. "I know because I'm the same way." Her voice was barely above a murmur. "I taught you that, or I tried to. You were 6 and you already had it, the left hand steadiness. I just showed you the names for what your hands already knew." Behind her, Chloe had descended to the bottom step and was sitting with her elbows on her knees. Watching them both, her expression unreadable except for the slight compression at the corners of her eyes that Liam had learned, in his 11 days here, was her version of strongly felt emotion carefully managed. "I don't have memories," Liam said. "Not complete ones. I have." He stopped. He started again. "I have sensory fragments. The smell of sandalwood, the velvet bench, a piano lid being slammed, a boardwalk, and a balloon." And then, he held out his hand, palm up, fingers open. "Nothing." Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a word. 26 years, she said. "They told me." She stopped. Her throat worked. "The doctors, the medications, Arthur's people, they told me it was grief. That what I remembered wasn't that my mind had." She pressed 2 fingers against her lips. "They were very insistent about what was real and what wasn't. For a very long time. The 3 empty slots in the pill organizer. The wheelchair ramp behind the locked door. All scheduling requests to be routed through Mr. Sterling's office." Chloe spoke for the first time. "She stopped taking them 6 weeks ago," she said quietly. "The sedatives. She's been coming back." Eleanor nodded, once, piece by piece. Liam looked at the DNA test kit in his hand. The small white box, unremarkable, The kind of thing you could buy online and receive in plain packaging and use in the privacy of your own home. To ask the question that your whole life has been orbiting for as long as you can remember. He looked up. I need to know, he said. I need it to be documented. I need it in writing, not in. He gestured between them, at the moonlit room, at the piano, at the impossible middle of the night. Convergence of two people who smelled the same memory when sandalwood was in the room. Not in this. In paper. Evidence. Eleanor looked at the kit in his hand. She extended her arm. Then let's start, she said. He opened the kit. Chloe came down from the step and crossed to the lamp near the bookshelf and turned it on, and in the warm low light of the living room, in the house where Arthur Sterling slept 3 floors above them, they did what they needed to do. The piano stood uncovered behind them, its keys still warm from what had just been played, and outside the Westchester night had gone very still. As though the white oaks and the cold air and the sleeping garden were all leaning slightly inward, listening. The results came back in 72 hours. Liam sat at his kitchen table in Queens with the printed report. He had paid extra for the printed version, because a screen can be dismissed as a screen, and he read the percentage at the top of the page. And then he read it again, and then he set it flat on the table and pressed both palms against the surface and looked out the cracked window at the gray November sky and breathed. 99.998%. Sibling match Chloe Ann Sterling. Parental match, paternal Arthur Reginald Sterling. Parental match, maternal Eleanor Grace Sterling. He had known since the night of the nocturne. Since Eleanor had extended her arm across 8 feet of moonlit marble with that absolute, terrible certainty in her face. He had known before that, in the cellular, pre-verbal way. He had been knowing it since he first walked through those iron gates and heard them groan like a warning. But the paper made it real in a different register. He called Chloe, whose number he now had. She answered on the first ring. I have mine too, she said immediately. Same percentages. I went to an independent lab, not the one you used, so we have 2 separate source documents. Okay. I also spoke to a family law attorney last night. Pro bono. A referral through a legal aid organization in White Plains. A pause. Julian. It was the first time anyone other than Eleanor had called him that. He held the phone and did not say anything for a moment. I know, he said. There's more, Chloe said. The guardianship filing you saw at the gala. I found the full document in Arthur's study. He's been trying to have Mom declared incompetent for 18 months. The medical records, the prescribing doctors, 2 of them are on a retainer arrangement through the Sterling Group's corporate account. Another pause. She was not sick, Julian. She was managed. He stood up from the kitchen table. He stood at the cracked window and looked at the November sky and thought about Eleanor in the garden. With 3 empty pill slots and the vacant, searching look of a woman trying to remember her way back through chemical fog. And he thought about the trust document in the doorway that 6-year-old Julian had last seen before the world went gray, and he thought about 26 years of an unanswered birthday photograph. I'll be there in an hour, he said. The meeting took place in Arthur Sterling's study. It had not been scheduled. That was intentional. Chloe had suggested it, and the attorney had agreed. No notice, no time to prepare a counter-narrative. It was a Wednesday morning. Arthur's standing day at the estate rather than Midtown, and Julian and Chloe and the attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei. 40, with the specific quality of calm that belongs to people who are never impressed by wealth. Because they've spent their careers watching what wealth does, arrived together at 9:47. Arthur was at his desk when the housekeeper showed them in. He looked at Julian first. The expression on his face cycled through several things in rapid succession: surprise, then the suppression of surprise, then the particular controlled stillness of a man recalculating. He looked at Chloe. He looked at the woman he didn't recognize. He looked back at Julian. You were fired, he said. I was, Julian said. And then I came back. Patricia Osei set a folder on the desk. Mr. Sterling, she said, we're here to discuss 2 matters. The first is the DNA documentation establishing Julian Sterling's biological relationship to you and to Mrs. Sterling. The second is the pattern of prescribing decisions made by Dr. Harrison and Dr. Bloom over the past 7 years, and their financial relationship to Sterling Group Holdings. She opened the folder. I also have the original estate trust document, the one your son Julian was named in at birth, which was filed with the county clerk's office in 1993 and never legally superseded, despite your estate attorney's 1999 filing which claimed otherwise. Arthur sat very still. He was 65 years old, and in this moment he looked it in the way that powerful men who have never been truly challenged sometimes age all at once when the challenge finally arrives, not a gradual thing, but sudden, the face dropping beneath the control like a structure releasing its tension. You have no standing in this, he said. His voice was still level, still the flat authority, but something at the edges of it was fraying. Whatever you think you know. The DNA results are from 2 independent certified laboratories, Julian said. We have the chain of custody documentation. We have the trust filing. We have the medical billing records. He paused. And we have Mom. Arthur looked at him. I've been speaking to her for 3 weeks, Julian said. Since she stopped the medication. She is recovering her memory with considerable consistency, and she has given a recorded statement to Ms. Osei's firm. You can't. She can, Chloe said, her voice carrying none of Julian's restraint and all of her own particular, clear-eyed anger. She's not incompetent, Dad. She never was. You made her incompetent. That's a very different thing. Arthur pushed back from the desk. He stood up, the motion of a man who has always been able to end rooms by standing, and he crossed to the window, and he stood looking out at the garden, the winter garden. The bare rose canes, the dry fountain, with his hands clasped behind his back, and for a long moment no one spoke. When he turned back, his face had reorganized into something that was not quite a negotiation and not quite a surrender, but occupied the narrow passage between them. What do you want? He said. He was looking at Julian. Julian thought about that for a moment. He thought about the 401k statement on the passenger seat, and the Medicare rejection notice on the kitchen table, and Margaret's voice on the voicemail. You sound tired lately. Are you eating? I love you, sweet boy. He thought about the cracked phone screen and the folding chair and the $1,100 balance and the child in the birthday photograph. With his face turned away, always turned away, toward something just out of frame. He thought about the nocturne, and how his hands had found it without being told, and how the music had not been frightening when it finally came out, how it had felt, instead, like a door opening in a room he'd been locked out of his entire life. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about Chloe, who had recognized his rhythm on a car door handle and had stored the recognition quietly. Like someone keeping evidence, like someone who had also been waiting. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed an envelope. He set it on the desk. Arthur looked at it. He did not pick it up. That's a cashier's check, Julian said. Made out from my own account. For the amount of 1 month's salary from your company. He paused. I'm not here for your money. I'm here for the record. I want the trust reinstated. I want my mother's prescribing physicians referred to the state medical board. I want the guardianship filing withdrawn. Today, with Ms. Osei as witness. He let that settle. And I want your attention, just for 1 moment. Arthur looked at him. You covered her piano, Julian said. For 26 years, you covered it. You medicated her until she couldn't remember why she was sad. You told a 6-year-old boy that he didn't belong to anyone, and you made sure the paperwork agreed with you. He was not raising his voice. The words were coming out flat and certain, the way the melody had come out of him in the moonlit living room, not performed, but found. I'm not going to tell you what that cost. You don't have the capacity to understand the accounting. I'm just going to tell you that it's done. And then I'm going to take my mother home. Arthur Sterling sat back down in his chair. He sat there for a long moment, looking at the check on the desk. Then he reached for the phone. He called his estate attorney. Patricia Osei opened her notepad. He did not sign immediately. There were procedural objections, counterpoints raised through Arthur's attorney via speakerphone, a period of perhaps 40 minutes, during which the room maintained its careful tension and Patricia Osei answered each point with the patient precision of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how it ends. Julian stood at the window during most of it, the same window Arthur had stood at, the same view of the winter garden. The boxwoods in their burlap, the stone girl with her empty jar, the dry fountain. He thought about what it would mean for this house to change. What it would look like with the shroud off the piano and Eleanor's prescriptions reduced to what she actually needed, which was nearly nothing, which the independent physician Chloe had found in White Plains had confirmed within a single consultation. What it would look like with the rooms unlocked and the air let in and the silence no longer organized by Arthur's preferences. He thought it would look like a house that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had finally been given permission to exhale. At 11:23, Arthur Sterling signed the withdrawal of the guardianship petition. At 11:41, he signed the reinstatement of the original trust instrument. At noon, Patricia Osei closed her folder, thanked him for his time in the tone of someone who does not mean it, and walked out of the study with Chloe. Julian was the last one to leave. At the door, he paused. Arthur was still at his desk. He had not moved since the second signing. He was looking at the check, the one Julian had brought, the one made out from his own $1,100 account, the one Julian had brought not as payment, but as a statement, and his face had lost whatever architecture it had been maintaining. He looked, in this moment, not like a powerful man who had been defeated, but like a man confronting a grief. He had tried to manage by burying it, and the burial had failed, and now the grief was sitting on his desk in an envelope, and it was smaller than he'd expected. Julian did not say anything. He left. March came early to Westchester that year. By the second week, the white oaks along the private drive had begun to green at the branch tips, small, tentative. The first color in a landscape that had been shades of gray for months. The stone fountain in the garden had been cleaned and filled, and the water moved again in its circular way, catching the morning light and scattering it across the garden beds where the first crocuses were pressing through. Eleanor had planted them. She had found the bulbs in a storage box in the potting shed, labeled in her own handwriting from years ago, a handwriting she barely recognized at first. Though it came back to her as so many things came back to her in those months, gradually, in layers, the way a landscape emerges from fog, not all at once, but in pieces, a roofline here, a tree line there, until suddenly you can see the whole of it and cannot remember exactly when you stopped being blind to it. She worked in the garden on Saturday mornings, alone. Not because she needed solitude, but because she had come to understand that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. Which was a distinction she had not been able to make when she was medicated. The pills had made her alone in a very specific way, sealed, removed, present in the body but absent from the interior. A person-shaped space where a person was supposed to be. Without them, the world had weight and temperature and consequence again, which was not always comfortable and was entirely worth it. She had asked Drive Reyes, the White Plains physician, about the timeline. How long had she been this way? The doctor had been careful with her answer, careful in the honest sense, not in the managed sense, and had said that the medication levels in her records suggested a pattern of incremental increase over approximately 7 years, with a pronounced escalation beginning around the time of the guardianship filing. Eleanor had listened and had nodded and had sat with it for a few days. And then she had decided that spending the rest of her life backward calculating the lost years was not something she was willing to do. The years were gone. The present was not. She had enough of the present to fill, she thought, for quite a long time. The apartment Julian and Chloe had found together was on the 6th floor of a building in White Plains, not large, but full of light, with south-facing windows that caught the afternoon sun and a kitchen big enough for a small table and 3 chairs, which was exactly what was needed. Eleanor had her own bedroom with a window that looked onto a courtyard where a maple was starting to bud. She made tea in the mornings and called it sufficient. She was rebuilding the vocabulary of ordinary life one small, specific act at a time, and she found she was better at it than she'd expected. Chloe came on Wednesdays and Sundays. She brought her sketchbook and her paint-stained fingers and her habit of sitting on the floor rather than the furniture. And she and Eleanor would spend hours in a comfortable quiet that was different from every other quiet Eleanor had known, not the managed stillness of medicated afternoons. Not the controlled silence of a house that ran on Arthur's preferences. But the easy silence of two people who had been separated for a long time and were now learning, carefully and without rushing, what they were to each other. They were learning it was more than either of them had dared to plan for. Julian drove Margaret to the new facility in White Plains on a Thursday. It was not a downgrade, it was considerably better than Astoria, more staff, better light, a small garden where residents could sit when the weather permitted. He had found it through the Foundation's network, which still surprised him slightly. The ease of it, the way resources moved differently when you had the standing to make requests that were heard. He was still adjusting to that. He suspected it would take some time. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of the Civic, her good coat buttoned to the collar, her handbag on her lap, and she watched the Westchester landscape move past the window with the alert, undimmed attention she had always brought to new places. She was 71 and sharp and had strong opinions about parking lots and weaker opinions about most everything else. "Nice trees," she said, as they turned onto the facility's drive. "You'll have a garden view," Julian said. "Good." She smoothed her coat. "I like to watch things grow." A pause. "You seem different." He glanced at her. "Not bad different," she said. "Settled. Like something that was loose got tightened." She looked at him with the particular directness of a woman who has earned it. "Did you find what you were looking for?" He thought about the nocturne, and the moonlit living room, and the DNA report on the kitchen table, and Eleanor extending her arm across 8 feet of marble. He thought about Chloe saying Julian for the first time, the single word carrying 26 years of its own particular weight. He thought about his name, written at the bottom of a legal document in his own handwriting, the ink bold and permanent against the formal paper. A signature that no longer felt like an approximation of something he almost was. "Yeah," he said, "I think I did." Margaret nodded, satisfied, and looked back out the window. "Good," she said. "Then let's go see the garden." The Foundation's first event was held in April. Julian had named it without much deliberation Sterling Forward, which he knew was a small irony and used it anyway. It was a legal aid and housing assistance program for young people aging out of the foster care system in Westchester and the 5 boroughs. Funded by his portion of the reinstated trust and staffed initially by 3 social workers and 1 attorney. The launch event was held in a community center in Yonkers. And it was not glamorous, and Julian stood at a folding table and shook hands and answered questions and watched young people 17, 18, 19, wearing the careful, composed faces of people who have learned to need very little receive information about resources that would not fix everything but would make some things less impossible. He thought he knew something about that. He thought perhaps that was the point. At home that evening, his apartment now, a different one from Queens. 2 bedrooms in White Plains. Within walking distance of his mother, Julian sat at the upright piano he'd found at an estate sale in Bronxville. A Kawai with good action and an honest sound. Nothing like the Steinway, but entirely adequate for someone who was not performing for anyone. He played the nocturne. He played it the way he had always played it, which was to say without deciding to play it, the melody arriving in his hands before his mind caught up, the left hand laying its foundation. The right hand following the long singing line upward, the phrases breathing between the notes as much as within them. He had looked it up after the living room night, needed to see the notation, to confirm that the thing in his hands was the same thing written on paper, and it was Chopin, Nocturne No. 20 in C-sharp minor. Posthumous, a piece that had never been intended for publication, that existed because someone played it and someone else wrote it down. And because the written thing had survived what the playing moment could not. It was, he thought, a reasonable thing to be. He played it through to the end. Outside the window, The March evening was cooling toward dark. The maple in the courtyard gone gray-blue against the sky, and in the apartment across the landing, Eleanor was making tea, and somewhere across the city, Chloe was painting something new, and somewhere in a facility with a garden view Margaret was watching the light go off the trees. Julian played the final phrase, slow and unhurried, the melody settling into its last quiet resolution. And then he lifted his hands from the keys and let the sound carry itself out until the room was still. He sat for a moment in the stillness. Then he reached for the foundation paperwork on the piano bench beside him and picked up a pen and, in the space provided on the document for director's legal name, wrote, Julian Sterling. The ink was bold and permanent and exactly what it had always been, waiting for him to find it. He signed it, and turned the page, and kept going. Friends, how did you find Julian's story today? I have to be honest with you, this one stayed with me. A man who didn't know his own name. A mother sealed away from her own memory by the people who were supposed to protect her. A sister who recognized a rhythm on a car door handle and held the evidence quietly. The way people hold onto things when they're not yet sure it's safe to speak. And a piano, covered in black velvet for 26 years, in a house full of silence that had been organized on someone else's behalf. There is something in Julian's story that I think speaks to all of us, not just those of us who have faced the specific injustice he faced, but anyone who has ever carried something without knowing quite what it was. A talent that had no home, an instinct that had no explanation, a sense that the story you've been living is not the whole story. Most of us never find out what's under the cover. Julian did, and he didn't find it by forcing it, he found it by playing. By letting his hands go where they already knew to go, in a room where no one had asked him to perform, in the middle of the night. When all the managed silence had finally gone to sleep. That's the lesson I take from today's story. The truth in you does not disappear because someone decided to cover it. It waits. It surfaces in the way you tap a rhythm without knowing why. It lives in the body when the mind has been told to forget. And when you find it, when you finally sit down and play, the music comes back. Every note. To everyone watching today who has ever felt that something essential in you was being managed, or minimized, or covered over by someone who needed you to be less than you, or this story is for you. You haven't lost what you carry. You're just waiting for the right room, the right moment, the right reason to play. I hope Julian's story brought you something real today. Something that stays with you the way the nocturne stayed with him, not as a memory of loss, but as proof of what survives. If it moved you, please leave a comment below. Share this story with someone who needs it. And don't forget, please subscribe, and hit that like button. We'll be here, same place, with another story worth telling. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time.